deficit that we have with certain countries, way over $1 billion per country. But with China, it's $1 trillion.
The saga of the tariffs imposed under former President Donald Trump's administration is emblematic of a broader reckoning with globalization, national security, and the shifting balance of economic power. Beginning in 2018, the Trump administration embarked on what it termed a crusade to level the playing field for American workers and industries, leveraging the power of punitive duties on imported steel, aluminum, and a wide swath of Chinese goods. These measures were not merely economic tools but instruments of diplomatic pressure designed to force trading partners, most notably China, but also key U.S. allies, to renegotiate terms long seen as skewed against American interests. Before we start, smash the like and subscribe buttons for more updates. At the core of Trump's trade policy were the steel and aluminum tariffs levied under Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act of 1962. In March 2018, the administration announced a 25% duty on all steel imports and a 10% duty on aluminum, citing threats to U.S. national security from reliance on foreign producers. This invocation of national security alarmed allies such as Canada, the European Union, Mexico, and Japan, each of which was swiftly granted temporary exemptions before ultimately facing the same tariffs. The immediate consequence was a surge in domestic steel production. American mills ramped up output to fill the shortfall created by import restrictions. Smelters in states like Pennsylvania and Ohio saw renewed life, and jobs touted as saved in steel communities formed the centerpiece of Trump's economic narrative. However, the downstream effects sparked controversies across American industry. Automakers, appliance manufacturers, and construction companies, consumers of steel and aluminum, warned of rising input costs that would either erode their margins or be passed on as higher prices to consumers. Many manufacturers sought exemptions, arguing that domestic producers could not supply certain specialized steel or aluminum grades. While the administration granted a handful of these requests, the process was opaque and slow, breeding frustration. Moreover, trading partners retaliated. The European Union imposed tariffs on iconic American goods like bourbon, motorcycles, and orange juice, turning the dispute into a trade war that rattled markets on both sides of the Atlantic. Concurrently, Trump unleashed a broader campaign against China under Section 301 of the Trade Act of 1974. Citing unfair practices including forced technology transfer, intellectual property theft, and government subsidies, the administration began in July 2018 by slapping 25% tariffs on $34 billion worth of Chinese imports. Over the next year, this list expanded in stages to cover roughly $250 billion in goods, everything from machinery parts to textiles, electronics, and consumer items. China responded in kind with levies on American agricultural products, hitting Midwestern farmers particularly hard and fueling fierce political debate within rural communities. The escalating tit-for-tat drew in a global cast of stakeholders. American soybean growers, key beneficiaries of U.S.-China trade, found themselves with dwindling export markets and grain gluts that depressed local prices. The Trump administration countered by announcing billions in emergency relief payments to farmers, a bailout of sorts that undercut its own free market rhetoric but endeared the president to a critical voting bloc. Meanwhile, multinational corporations faced complex supply chain dilemmas. Should they absorb the added costs, pass them on, shift production to other countries, or seek exemption? Some chose to diversify their sourcing away from China to Southeast Asia, Mexico, or even back to the US, accelerating what analysts termed China Plus One strategies. Legally, the tariffs sparked dozens of challenges at the World Trade Organization, WTO. The European Union, Canada, and other affected nations argued that the Section 232 tariffs were a pretext, lacking genuine national security justification. In response, the Trump administration launched parallel efforts to reform the WTO dispute settlement mechanism, alleging that it stifled U.S. sovereignty. These fights underscored broader tensions about the adequacy of existing global trade rules to address modern economic and strategic complexities. By late 2019, with the U.S. and China teetering on the brink of deeper hostilities, negotiators brokered what became known as the Phase 1 Agreement. China committed to purchase an additional $200 billion of U.S. goods over 2 years and to strengthen intellectual property protections. In return, the U.S. agreed to reduce some, but not all, tariffs, postponing planned increases and canceling new rounds. Yet most duties remained in place, leaving the specter of the broader trade war intact. Furthermore, actual Chinese purchases lagged targets, and the agreement's enforcement provisions raised questions about effectiveness. When President Joe Biden took office in January 2021, he inherited this tangled legacy. While publicly keeping the tariffs in place, the Biden administration launched reviews of their economic impact and considered whether to adjust rates. In some cases, additional carve-outs were granted, for instance, for certain semiconductor manufacturing equipment vital to U.S. technology ambitions. Nonetheless, the tariffs remain a tool of leverage in broader negotiations over supply chain resilience, technology competition, and climate-related industrial policies. Today, in mid-2025, the long-term effects of Trump's tariffs are still being debated. Proponents point to revitalized steel capacity and a renewed awareness of industrial overdependence on foreign suppliers. They argue that tariffs served as a wake-up call, catalyzing critical investments in domestic manufacturing and spurring allies to rethink their own industrial strategies. The Inflation Reduction Act and the CHIPS and Science Act, landmark Biden-era laws offering subsidies and tax incentives for clean energy and semiconductor production, echo the administration's goals of reshoring and strategic autonomy that first surfaced during the tariff fights. Critics counter that the costs outweighed the benefits. A study by the Federal Reserve Bank of New York estimated that American consumers paid an additional $68 billion annually due to tariffs imposed between 2018 and 2019. Industries reliant on imported intermediate goods suffered reduced competitiveness in global markets. Moreover, the uncertainty created by an unpredictable trade policy, where tariffs could be imposed or lifted at the stroke of a presidential tweet, frayed trust among allies and trading partners. Some economists suggest that the one-off jolt of protectionism did not translate into sustained industrial revival. Instead, global firms permanently adjusted their supply chains away from the U.S., diluting potential long-term gains. On the legal front, several WTO appellate rulings have since struck down certain aspects of the Trump tariffs, reinforcing the principle that national security exemptions should not become carte blanche for protectionism. European and Canadian steel faced gradual market reopenings as WTO panels deemed the U.S. assertions of military vulnerability overstated. Meanwhile, WTO litigation over Section 301 actions against China remains pending, highlighting the slow grind of international arbitration. Politically, the Trump tariffs have left an indelible mark on U.S. trade discourse. Both major parties now accept, at least rhetorically, the idea that unfettered free trade can produce adverse outcomes. Presidential contenders of various stripes have voiced support for smart or fair trade, signaling a departure from the post-Cold War consensus that globalization was an unalloyed good. The question now is how to balance open markets, technological leadership, and strategic security without triggering the counterproductive cycles of retaliation witnessed in 2018, 2020. The ripple effects of the Trump-era tariffs continue to unfurl across myriad facets of the U.S. economy, touching corners that lie far from the discussions of steel mills and soybean fields. Consider, for instance, the automotive sector. While the initial tariffs on steel and aluminum were framed as a boon to domestic producers, the added cost burdens translated into subtle shifts in procurement strategies. Some automakers quietly accelerated efforts to source lighter-weight aluminum alloys from Canada and Europe under existing free trade agreements, while others rerouted supply chains toward low-cost producers in South America. Simultaneously, the broader focus on reshoring and the specter of renewed U.S. duties motivated a handful of greenfield investments in southern states, where automakers and battery manufacturers seized incentives under the Inflation Reduction Act. Although these projects cannot be traced solely to the memory of Section 232 tariffs, the sense of urgency they instilled in corporate boardrooms undoubtedly contributed to the accelerated timelines for gigafactories in Georgia, Tennessee, and beyond. Beyond manufacturing, the services sector felt the undercurrents of heightened protectionism in more intangible ways. For financial institutions, The period between 2018 and 2021 was marked by a recalibration of risk models that had long treated trade policy as a stable background condition. Investment banks and private equity firms began to factor in political risk not only in emerging markets, but also in the developed economies of North America and Europe. Scenario analyses envisaged abrupt spikes in input costs for portfolio companies, prompting covenant waivers, hedging strategies against commodity price volatility, and the inclusion of force majeure clauses tied to government-imposed duties. In some corners of Wall Street, the unexpected resurgence of tariffs served as a cautionary tale. The conventional wisdom that trade would only ever liberalize had proved complacent. The technology industry, too, experienced its own distortions. Companies that had constructed sprawling just-in-time supply chains with minimal domestic buffer stocks suddenly confronted the prospect that critical components, from printed circuit boards to rare earth magnets, could be ensnared in rounds of tit-for-tat levies. A wave of nearshoring emerged, not toward the United States, but to friendly jurisdictions such as Mexico and Costa Rica, where production costs remained competitive and proximity to U.S. markets assured shorter transit times. Meanwhile, the U.S. government's clearer articulation of tariffs as a tool of geopolitical leverage opened new dialogues between industry and regulators. Technology firms, for the first time in decades, lobbied earnestly for alignment between industrial policy and trade enforcement, seeking, for example, safeguards that would penalize imports made with forced labor, or that lacked environmental safeguards, while exempting legitimate technology transfers under strict reciprocity. Perhaps most enduring has been the impact on global perceptions of U.S. reliability as a trading partner. In Southeast Asia, where nimble contract manufacturers once viewed the United States as the anchor customer, many firms now hedge their bets. Investment flows have veered toward markets with evergreen free trade agreements: Vietnam, Thailand, Malaysia, where the risk of abrupt tariff escalation seems remote. In Europe, policymakers doubled down on efforts to complete their own internal single market in digital services and green technology, determined to reduce dependency on both Washington and Beijing. For the World Trade Organization, the U.S. posture of invoking national security to justify broad-based tariffs forced a re-examination of the organization's charter, prompting discussions about codifying clearer definitions of security exceptions. Whether these reforms will materialize remains an open question. At the federal level, the policy legacy of the tariff years can be seen in the architecture of subsequent legislation. The CHIPS and Science Act, for instance, explicitly referred to critical supply chain resilience, earmarking funds for semiconductor capacitor production, which had been identified as a vulnerability when duties threatened to constrain the inflow of specialized components. Similarly, the bipartisan infrastructure law directed billions toward port modernization projects, partly to insulate against potential bottlenecks that could arise if tariffs prompted companies to reroute shipping routes or pre-position goods in domestic warehouses. These infrastructural investments acknowledge a reality that the tariff debates made plain. In a world of punitive duties and countermeasures, logistical agility is itself a strategic asset. On Main Street, however, the story has been more uneven. Small manufacturers lacking the scale or the capital to pivot their supply chains either absorbed costs or quietly shrank operations. In regions like the Rust Belt, where steel towns once reveled in the promise of tariff-induced revival, the actual infusion of new orders proved sporadic. Plant managers reported that while certain commodity-grade contracts returned, the higher-margin projects, specialized alloy work for automotive or defense, remained subject to long lead times and expensive domestic premiums. Some entrepreneurs adapted by specializing in niche products, touting Made in USA branding with greater zeal, but others found the domestic market too small to sustain the premium pricing their overhead required. Agricultural producers likewise continued to navigate the aftermath of Chinese retaliation. Although the Phase 1 deal stipulated large-scale purchases of soybeans, pork, and other staples, deliveries never reached the ambitious quotas laid out in early 2020. Chinese officials cited weather events, logistical constraints, and shifting domestic priorities, including an increased emphasis on supporting homegrown farmers, as reasons for the shortfall. Meanwhile, U.S. grain traders forged relationships in South America and Eastern Europe, diversifying export destinations to buffer against political risk. That resilience called into question whether an asymmetric reliance on emergency subsidy payments was, in fact, a prudent long-term strategy for America's breadbasket. In Congress, the tariff episode has reshaped alliances across the aisle. While Republican leaders continue to champion tough on China rhetoric, they have grown more circumspect about unfettered use of Section 232 powers, emphasizing the importance of narrow, targeted measures. Democrats, for their part, have embraced a more muscular industrial policy, even as they criticize the unilateralism of the previous administration's approach. The result has been a de facto consensus. No longer is unrestricted free trade an article of faith, but neither is wholesale protectionism. Instead, legislators now discuss industrial symbiosis, a concept borrowed from ecological theory that envisions manufacturing clusters in which firms share inputs, waste streams, and innovation outputs, with the strategic use of trade tools to reward such integrated ecosystems. Public opinion has mirrored this nuanced shift. Surveys conducted by the Pew Research Center and Gallup in late 2024 revealed that a majority of Americans believe trade policy should prioritize job security and supply chain resilience over the lowest possible consumer prices. Yet, within that majority, there is deep skepticism about whether repeated tariff battles serve those ends. Many respondents express fatigue over the constant churn of trade disputes, desiring instead a stable, rules-based system they can rely on, one that balances national interests with the benefits of open markets. This sentiment has translated into growing support for bipartisan frameworks that emphasize multilateral cooperation, whether through revamped trade pacts or joint investment initiatives in critical technologies such as clean energy and advanced manufacturing. Looking toward the next presidential cycle, candidates from both parties face a delicate balancing act. They must offer credible plans to counter China's industrial might and secure supply chains for semiconductors, batteries, and medical supplies, all the while reassuring allies that the United States will not resort to abrupt tariffs as a first resort. Proposals now under discussion include expedited pathways for allies to petition for temporary trade measures, complete with transparent oversight, and preset sunset clauses that force legislative review. Such mechanisms, advocates argue, could restore confidence in American trade policy by weaving in accountability and predictability. Internationally, the post-tariff era is spurring fresh alliances. The Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, launched under President Biden, seeks to bind like-minded democracies in a network of supply chain partnerships without resorting to binding tariff commitments. In Europe, the recently concluded US-EU Trade and Technology Council provides a forum to coordinate tariffs, standards, and export controls on emerging technologies, aiming to present a united front against coercive economic practices. While these initiatives avoid direct tariff narratives, their underlying logic, using trade policy as a strategic tool, bears the unmistakable imprint of the debates ignited by the Trump administration. At the granular level of individual industries, companies are integrating tariff stress tests into their annual planning cycles. Much as they conduct cybersecurity drills or pandemic tabletop exercises, corporate leaders now simulate scenarios in which key inputs face 10%, 25%, or even 50% tariffs overnight. These drills extend beyond direct suppliers to logistics providers, legal counsel, and government relations teams, creating playbooks that anticipate potential carve-outs or retaliatory rounds. The recognition is unanimous. Even if broad tariffs recede into history, the prospect of trade disruptions is now a permanent dimension of corporate risk management. Economic research institutions have begun to produce more sophisticated models that capture these dynamic interactions. Unlike legacy computable general equilibrium models that presuppose smooth market adjustments, the new generation of agent-based simulations accommodates firm-level heterogeneity, supply chain linkages, and policy feedback loops. Preliminary findings suggest that a series of modest targeted duties, combined with offsetting domestic incentives, can sometimes yield net gains in investment and employment, whereas broad tariffs often produce unintended knock-on effects. Such insights are already being cited in congressional hearings and policy white papers, signaling a gradual but important shift toward data-driven trade governance. Meanwhile, the steel industry itself has moved to lock in some of the gains wrought by the early tariffs. Large producers have negotiated long-term supply agreements with the U.S. government and defense contractors, ensuring priority for military shipbuilding and infrastructure projects. Mid-sized mills have formed consortia to share research and development costs for low-carbon steelmaking technologies, recognizing that environmental imperatives may represent the next frontier of competitiveness. In some cases, these alliances trace their origins to the renewed sense of domestic solidarity that emerged when former competitors rallied around the idea of American steel in the face of rising imports. On the consumer front, retail giants and e-commerce platforms have adapted to a marketplace where product origins and tariff statuses can shift rapidly. Sophisticated software now tags items by country of origin, material composition, and applicable duty rate in real time, routing orders through automated decision trees that choose the most cost-effective fulfillment center or dropship partner. These systems also generate alerts when regulatory changes threaten to upset existing stock allocations, giving procurement teams precious weeks to respond. The result is a more responsive, albeit more complex retail ecosystem, one in which hidden tariff dynamics are subtly factored into price tags and delivery times. Education and workforce development have also felt the long wave of tariff-driven industrial policy. Community colleges and technical institutes in states like Michigan, Indiana, and South Carolina have launched retraining programs focused on advanced manufacturing skills, robotics, additive manufacturing, and digital quality control. Funding for these programs is increasingly tied to metrics of regional resilience, intended to reduce reliance on distant supply chains. In interviews, administrators emphasized that the impetus for these programs was not simply the promise of new jobs, but the recognition that American manufacturing must evolve to compete in a world where questions of national security and economic independence are inseparable. Yet, for all the shifts in strategy and posture, fundamental questions persist. Can tariffs ever be calibrated finely enough to achieve strategic objectives without provoking broader retaliation? Will domestic incentives, once designed to offset the negative distortionary effects of duties, ultimately create an industrial policy jungle where every sector competes for its own set of subsidies and protections? And perhaps most importantly, can multinational cooperation be rekindled after the deep fissures of the 2018-2020 tariff battles? As the United States charts its course through the second quarter of the 21st century, the legacy of Trump's tariffs will continue to echo. In diplomatic corridors, negotiators now enter discussions with an acute awareness that the U.S. presidency wields formidable unilateral trade powers. In boardrooms, supply chain strategists ingrain tariff contingencies into long-term capital plans. In classrooms, budding engineers learn a version of economic history where free trade's promises were beset by the exigencies of geopolitics. And in legislatures, lawmakers refine the delicate art of wielding trade policy as a scalpel rather than a sledgehammer. In the realm of small and medium-sized enterprises, SMEs, the aftermath of the Trump-era tariffs has prompted a wave of innovation in financial hedging products and advisory services. Niche consulting firms have sprung up, specializing in tariff risk audits, which assess a company's vulnerability across its entire value chain. These audits delve into the provenance of every component, evaluating the likelihood of duty impositions under various geopolitical scenarios. Armed with these insights, procurement teams negotiate more agile contracts, incorporating clauses that allow for dynamic repricing or alternative sourcing triggers. Simultaneously, financial markets responded with the creation of bespoke instruments, tariff futures and options, that permit companies to hedge against potential rate changes on key commodity classes. While still nascent and thinly traded, these tools reflect a maturing recognition that trade policy is an economic risk factor worthy of the same quantitative modeling historically reserved for currency or interest rate exposure. Within the energy sector, the reverberations of the tariff conflicts have rippled through global LNG and pipeline projects. U.S. exporters of liquefied natural gas found that steel tariffs initially increased the cost of specialized pipeline-grade steel, squeezing margins. and delaying certain infrastructure expansions. To compensate, companies sought alliances with steel producers willing to guarantee long-term steel supplies at pre-tariff price indices, effectively prepaying for material at below-market rates. Conversely, foreign energy firms eyeing U.S. shale plays recalibrated their investment decisions, factoring in the risk that midstream and downstream assets could become costlier to build or maintain if future administrations resurrected aggressive tariff stances. The upshot has been a series of joint venture contracts structured with built-in tariff pass-through clauses, agreements that automatically adjust equity shares or tolling fees in response to changes in import duties. Meanwhile, the construction and real estate industries have woven the diffuse impacts of the tariff era into long-term project planning. Developers, mindful of potential steel and aluminum cost volatility, began locking in prices for key structural materials years in advance through forward contracts and escrow arrangements. In public-private partnerships for infrastructure, state and municipal authorities now routinely include trade disruption clauses in concession agreements, stipulating how costs above a predetermined threshold, should they arise from government-imposed duties, are allocated between public entities and private contractors. These measures aim to shield taxpayers from bearing the brunt of sudden tariff hikes while still allowing private sector partners to manage their own exposure. In the insurance domain, underwriters have likewise adjusted. Policies covering political risk or supply chain interruption now often feature explicit exclusions or sublimits tied to tariff-related events. Insurers deploy teams of trade policy analysts who track legislative proposals and executive orders globally, feeding proprietary indices that drive premium adjustments in near real time. For industries like consumer electronics, where margins are wafer-thin and component mix is intricate, insurers have begun offering parametric coverage that pays out automatically when defined tariff levels are breached, sidestepping lengthy loss adjustment processes and providing immediate liquidity to policyholders. Beyond the private sector, academia has embraced the tariff years as fertile ground for research into the intersection of economic policy and complex systems. Economists have collaborated with data scientists to harness machine learning techniques, analyzing granular customs data to detect early signals of supply chain realignment. These models can, for example, identify sudden shifts in shipping routes or unusual spikes in imports from third-country intermediaries, signs that firms are rerouting around tariff barriers. Such work has culminated in public dashboards that inform policymakers and industry leaders alike, enhancing market transparency and potentially forestalling knee-jerk reactions to emerging trends. Cultural and consumer attitudes have also subtly evolved. The net result of witnessing repeated tariff skirmishes has been a growing segment of consumers who are willing to pay a premium for provenance information and import duty assurances. Artisanal and heritage brands have capitalized on this trend, emphasizing not only made in USA labels but also duty-assured credentials, guaranteeing that products were sourced and shipped under stable trade conditions. Retailers, in turn, curate tariff-safe sections in their stores, both physical and digital, where customers can shop with confidence that prices won't be upended by an unexpected policy announcement. On the environmental front, the intersection of tariffs and climate policy has proven particularly complex. Some clean energy technologies rely on specialized components, such as solar-grade polysilicon and wind turbine castings, that at one point faced elevated duty risks. To mitigate this, renewable energy developers began structuring financier agreements with drawdown schedules that tie capital release to specific supply chain benchmarks, ensuring that project funding is contingent on verified tariff-free sourcing. At the same time, the looming specter of carbon border adjustment mechanisms in Europe has prompted U.S. policymakers to consider reciprocal green tariffs, which would penalize imported goods based on their carbon intensity. While still in the proposal stages, these concepts underscore the complexity of reconciling climate objectives with the legacy of tariff warfare. Philanthropic and nonprofit organizations have also entered the fray, launching initiatives to bolster the resilience of vulnerable supply chain communities. For example, foundations in the agricultural heartland have funded cooperative grain storage facilities, enabling small farmers to pool resources and negotiate bulk shipping contracts that are less susceptible to trade policy fluctuations. Similarly, Industrial workforce foundations have sponsored mobile training units that bring advanced manufacturing skill workshops directly to rural areas, bridging the gap between high-tech reskilling and local economic opportunities. On the diplomatic front, the U.S. has leveraged the lessons of the tariff era to refine its foreign assistance strategies. Development aid programs now often include trade policy capacity building components, working with partner countries to strengthen their customs administrations, improve tariff classification systems, and enhance transparency in duty assessments. By promoting clear and predictable trade regimes abroad, U.S. agencies aim to reduce the likelihood that their own exporters will face opaque or arbitrary barriers. A recognition that stability in global trade norms benefits both donor and recipient. Finally, at the level of individual consciousness, a generation of business leaders, policymakers, and workers has internalized the lesson that trade policy is not a static backdrop, but a dynamic instrument of statecraft. Whether through advanced degree programs in international trade law or corporate rotations that embed young executives in government agencies, the professional ecosystem now integrates trade policy savvy as a core competency. In this sense, one of the most enduring legacies of the Trump tariffs may be the cultivation of a cadre of practitioners for whom the intersection of economics and geopolitics is second nature, ensuring that future debates over duties and defenses will be conducted with a depth of expertise hitherto unseen. If you liked this video, please give it a like and subscribe to our channel. Also, leave your comments below and tell us, what are your thoughts on Trump's tariffs? What impact do you think they'll have? We want to hear from you. Thank you for watching and see you next time.